Okay, so before we start all the math, here's the inspiration for this project. Wabi Sabi is a traditional Japanese worldview, which has led to an aesthetic used in all kinds of traditional art, like rock gardens and pottery. This specific Wabi Sabi bowl is the main source of inspiration for my 3D scene, with the main goal being a fully procedural porcelain shader. I knew the gold fillings would be the component to create last, since the main porcelain shader itself is pretty complex. This is just one material, and it has all kinds of separate components, starting with white flakes from the bottom, becoming noise and even stripes near the top, and using an interesting edge wear to get this darkening effect. Okay, so let's get to work. Starting this project, I modeled out a bowl that matched our reference, but I kept the modeling simple and moved on, since all of the detail will be done in shaders. And speaking of shaders, I wanted to start off with some detailed pointiness masks. Just as a side note, pointiness won't work in Eevee, which is fine for me, since my laptop can run this material in cycles pretty quickly, and I'm obviously rendering it in cycles anyway. So if you want it in Eevee, check out the inside setting for ambient occlusion. Okay, like I said earlier, I'm using this pointiness mask to get the dark rim effect that we see in our reference image, which took a bunch of tweaking, but it gave me a mask that looks like this. And after adding that to our simple base layer of porcelain, we got a pretty neat effect. Now let's go ahead and add the rings we see in the middle of our bowl. By scaling down noise on the X and Y, we can increase its scale and detail to get these nice rings. We'll add contrast through a map range node, and we can always increase the roughness to get smaller rings. So it's up to you how you style it. And as you can tell, I used noise to add varying thickness across these lines, which adds a lot more detail. So now that we've got these three main layers, we can really see the shader coming together. The rest of the work we need to do involves adding small details and tweaking every parameter. Let's start with the detail. Stuff like these random dots we see in our reference can be made with simple Voronoi noise. Along with these white dots near the base of our bowl, we can really add as many imperfections as we want to the shader. With each addition, we change the story of our bowl. For example, we can add slight chips and scratches to our surface to make it feel like it lives in a sushi restaurant, or make it feel like a pristine museum piece, full of history. These details can both add realism and tell a story, and that's why I had so much fun making the gold fillings. So to get this strange intersecting mask, I made two noise textures. I used some simple math to give them lines in the mid-range and squared them. I did this twice, squaring both textures. Now, if we add them together, they combine in a non-linear way, so they have rounded intersections. Here's a simple setup where the maximum is removing all negatives from this gradient. But as you can tell, when we use squared gradients and add them together, we can get a rounded corner. And as you can guess, this is used in all kinds of rounding designs, and even making primitives. For example, you can make a circular gradient by just squaring X and Y and adding them together, super easily. And now that we know that squared gradients can be added to round things together, we can avoid the sharp angles that we would find when we usually overlay two noise textures. So here, you can't find any sharp intersections, even if they're two noise textures. This whole mess here is to make multiple thickness masks. So I made a quick tool to give me this dynamic thickness slider, which isn't a less than, since it's only using map range node, it still keeps this gradual fall off, even though it's pretty sharp. And we obviously use these masks to reveal the gold fillings that we see in the porcelain. That means they're influencing both the roughness and the metalness of the shader. And I made a couple variants of this mask to get some interesting color details. And as you can see, it's not just a solid color. I used some of these masks to add some complexity on the inside of the gold. Alright, now with our main systems in place, there's a few more details we need to add. Outside of our main shader, I added a few Blender Market assets in the background, like these two wooden boards, which didn't match the scene very well, so I reworked both of their shaders. I did this a couple times on these chopsticks, a wooden bowl, and this background bowl, which ends up being blurred out due to depth of field, so I didn't add much detail to it. Just for fun, I added this soy sauce stain inside of it, which didn't end up being useful, but it was funny to make. These are all background assets, and I used compositing to make them a bit less distracting. But that's about all I did for the rest of the scene, so let's go back to our main shader. We have a pretty solid diffuse or base color input, but we should make sure we have an interesting normal and roughness input too. So I used two Voronoi textures to create this bump mask that would influence our normals. It's super slight, but you can still see it in the final render. I also added a roughness mask, but I made sure the diffuse input would be the star of the show. And going forward, it might be helpful to have a custom HDRI in the scene. I always keep a couple in my HDRI folder, but you can easily find one on a site like Polyhaven. I didn't focus too much on lighting the scene with 3-point lighting because I wanted it to look real and not like product placement. But yes, after some really basic compositing, I got an image that I'm happy with. But don't leave yet, because I'm making a Q&A video. So if you have any questions for me to answer, leave them in the comments or get ready for a Blender Q&A live stream, which will take place on the 14th. See you soon, live.